So thank you very, very much, everyone, and welcome. My name is Haim Yacobi. I'm from the Development Planning Unit. And this presentation today by Professor Andy Clarno is part of a research project I'm conducting with Charlotte Leminsky from University of Cambridge and Moriel Ram from University of Newcastle, supported by the Urban Studies Foundation. And the title of the project is Infrastructure, Inequality, and the New Apartheid City. As part of this project, we have three workshops. One of them is the one that we've started this morning, and Andy's talk is part of this event. Before I'll introduce Andy, I would like to emphasize that this event is recorded, and it is also, we also have interpretation to Arabic, which is featured or provided by the interpreting and language team at the London Metropolitan University, which I really would like to thank. If you want to link yourself to the interpretation in Arabic, all you have to do is to go to the interpretation icon on the right bottom side of your screen, click on it and click on Arabic, and then you'll have it. So I hope that it works. Thank you very much. Another comment, if you have any questions or any comments during the presentation, please add it to the chat, and then we can present it to Andy at the end of his talk. But what I would like to say is that, you know, when we've started thinking about this workshop, for me, it was very obvious that we need to invite Andy Clarno to present his work. The reason is that when I've read his, in my view, excellent book a few years ago, it really started making me thinking on what is the meaning of apartheid these days in general, and as part of my work on Israel-Palestine in particular. And I think, Andy, then we've just exchanged some emails, but this idea really, you know, kept circulated, and then I've shared it with some other colleagues, including Charlotte and Maury. And I think that's somehow how this project, you know, came into life. Andy is an associate professor of sociology and Black studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research examines racism, capitalism, colonialism, and empire in the early 21st century, with focus on policing and struggle for social justice. Andy's first book, which I've mentioned before, Neoliberal Apartheid, traces the shifting dynamics of racial capitalism and settler colonialism in South Africa and Palestine, Israel over the last 25 years. And as I've mentioned, I think it's one of the best pieces on this kind of comparative study between Israel, Palestine, and South Africa. Importantly, and I think also relevant to Andy's talk today, is that Andy is a coordinator of the Policing in Chicago Research Group, a team faculty and graduate students that provides research support to social movements confronting police repression. The group is working on a co-authored book manuscript documenting the links between local police, federal immigration authorities, and national security agencies. So Andy, thank you very much for waking up today so early for us. And thank you very much for agreeing to be our first keynote speaker in a series of 3 workshops.
Hey, thanks so much, Haim. Thanks to Charlotte and Maury also for organizing this series of workshops. The presentations this morning, I did wake up quite early. It's only 6:30 here in Chicago at this point, but they've been fantastic. The talks by Leopold and Ola have been very stimulating, and we've had a really great conversation about the limits of the concept of apartheid, about the class aspects of apartheid, the kind of multiple scales at which apartheid operates, all really stimulating. And you know, it's an honor to be invited to serve as a keynote on today's workshop, and I'm really excited about our conversation today. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen with some slides. All right, can you see? Cool. Okay. Right. So this paper is kind of starts off by building on some of the work that was in my book, and then moves towards some newer work about thinking about policing as a global and imperial project that coalesces in particular ways in particular contexts. But we'll get to that. So, as Israel intensifies its settler colonial project in Palestine, apartheid has become an increasingly common and increasingly useful framework for understanding and challenging Israeli rule. In 2017, a report by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia argued that Israel's apartheid regime oppresses and dominates the Palestinian people as a whole. In 2019, a coalition of international human rights organizations sent a report to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, demonstrating that Israel's discriminatory policies meet the legal definition of apartheid. And just this year, both Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem released reports declaring Israel an apartheid state. This analysis is not new. As early as the 1961, South African Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, who is known as the architect of apartheid, insisted that, quote, Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. He, of course, meant that as a celebration. Since the 1960s, Palestinian and South African liberation movements have compared the regimes, and these comparisons grew more common during the 1990s, and they gained global attention at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, where the NGO Forum declared that Israel is a racist apartheid state in which Israel's brand of apartheid as a crime against humanity has been characterized by separation and segregation, dispossession, restricted land access, denationalization, Bantustanization, and inhumane acts. Ever since that time, scholars, journalists, activists, and even US politicians like Jimmy Carter and Bernie Sanders have used the language of apartheid to challenge Israeli policies. Critiques of Israeli apartheid document the formal legal discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, the dual legal system in the occupied territories, with Israeli settlers subject to Israeli civil law and Palestinians subject to Israeli military law, and Israel's refusal to allow the Palestinian refugees to exercise the right of return. They also note the similarities between the South African pass laws and Israel's permit regime, and between the Bantustans in apartheid-era South Africa and the Palestinian enclosures in the occupied territories today. Legal scholars often argue that these comparisons with South Africa are not particularly important, that what really matters is the fact that Israel violates the international legal definition of apartheid. Under international law, apartheid is a crime against humanity, and states can be held accountable. The International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid defines apartheid as a crime involving inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. And the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defines apartheid as an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups. All four of the reports that I mentioned earlier are based on close readings of these international legal statutes, and their importance can't be overstated. The reports contribute to a growing global denunciation of Israeli settler colonialism, and they demonstrate the potential of international law as a tool for holding regimes like Israel accountable. My book, Neoliberal Apartheid, also argues that Israel maintains an apartheid regime throughout historic Palestine. But while acknowledging the importance of international law as a tool and a resource for communities in struggle, I joined Palestinian lawyer and organizer Noura Erakat in adding a note of caution about the limitations of the legal approach. International laws are only effective when they're enforced by states, and the hierarchical structure of the United Nations provides a handful of states with veto power, including the United States. In addition, the international legal definition of apartheid is limited because it focuses on the political regime of racial rule and therefore obscures the political economy of apartheid, including the role of capitalism and empire in the operation of apartheid regimes. To address this concern, I build on an alternative definition of apartheid as a system of racial capitalism. This analysis builds on a critique that emerged during the South African struggle for liberation. In the 1970s and 1980s, Black South Africans engaged in urgent debates about how to understand the apartheid system that they were fighting. The most powerful bloc within the liberation movement, the African National Congress and its allies, defined apartheid as colonialism of a special type. They argued that racism and capitalism were distinct and that the struggle should develop in two stages. First, a struggle against the racist apartheid state, and later, a struggle against capitalism. The first stage involved a demand for legal equality, expressed in the slogan, "One person, one vote." The radical wing of the movement rejected this analysis. The Black consciousness movement and independent Marxists came together in groups like the Azanian People's Organization, AZAPO, and the National Forum to develop an analysis of apartheid as a system of racial capitalism. Predicting that legal equality would not create real transformation, they insisted that the movement confront the system as a whole. In the Azanian Manifesto, they declared, quote, "Our struggle for national liberation is directed against the system of racial capitalism, which holds the people of Azania in bondage for the benefit of a small minority of white capitalists and their allies, the white workers and the reactionary sections of the Black middle class. Only the eradication of the system of racial capitalism can put an end to apartheid." The South African critique of racial capitalism is perhaps less well known than the critique developed by Cedric Robinson. While Robinson's argument was general, capitalism has always been racial and can't be otherwise, the South African critique was more context specific. And the reason it was more context specific was because it emerged in the crucible of struggle as a theoretical framework that was closely linked to debates about political strategy. Like W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James, South African radicals like Neville Alexander were focused on the shifting relationship between racialized class fractions, the white capitalists, the white workers, the Black working class, the Black middle class. In particular, what they were worried about is that the ANC's two-stage strategy would allow the white capitalists to carry out a shift in their alliances from an alliance between the white capitalists and the white working class to a shift between the white capitalists and the Black petty bourgeoisie. So the idea was that, right, with this shift, they would discard the most overt forms of state racism in order to protect the underlying system of racial capitalism. So rather than a narrow focus on the racial state, what AZAPO envisioned was a struggle led by the Black working class that would topple the racial capitalist system as a whole. The transition in South Africa over the last 25 years has validated, in many ways, this Black radical tradition. In 1994, legal apartheid was abolished and Black South Africans gained formal legal equality. It was a remarkable achievement, but it was not sufficient for liberation. Despite the democratization of the state, the South African transition did not address the structures of racial capitalism. During the negotiations, the ANC made major concessions to win the support of white South Africans and the global capitalist elites. Most importantly, the ANC accepted constitutional protections for the existing distribution of land and property. Despite the long history of colonial dispossession, existing relations of private property were accepted. And the state has not carried out an aggressive form of land redistribution since that time. So over the last 27 years, only 7.5% of South African land has been redistributed. The state also adopted a neoliberal economic strategy that promotes free trade, export-oriented industry, and the corporatization of municipal services. As a result, wealth gaps have increased, and South Africa is now recognized as the most unequal country in the world. Neoliberal restructuring has facilitated the emergence of a small Black elite and an emerging Black middle class, but the old white elite still controls the vast majority of land and wealth in the country. In the words of Achille Mbembe, quote, "This is the only country on earth in which a revolution took place, which resulted in not one single former oppressor losing anything." Meanwhile, the lives of South Africa's Black working class are as precarious as ever. deindustrialization, and casualization have weakened the labor movement, intensified the exploitation of the Black working class, and produced a growing racialized surplus population that suffers from landlessness, segregation, poverty, and repression. According to international law, apartheid ends with the elimination of legalized racial discrimination. Yet even a cursory glance at South Africa after 1994 reveals the pitfalls of such an approach and highlights the importance of rethinking our definition of apartheid. And this really, picks up on conversations we were having during the last session. As critical race scholars in the United States have argued, formal legal equality did not produce real social and economic transformation in South Africa. Instead, the neoliberalization of racial capitalism has entrenched the inequality created by centuries of colonialism and apartheid. Some scholars make a case that there's been a shift in South Africa from racial apartheid to class apartheid. But apartheid was always about race and class, and it's still about both race and class. In the words of the late Neville Alexander, one of the drafters of the Azanian Manifesto, quote, "What we used to call the apartheid capitalist system has simply given way to the post-apartheid capitalist system." Critiques of Israeli apartheid have largely ignored the limits of transformation in South Africa. Instead of treating apartheid as a system of racial capitalism, most critiques of Israeli apartheid rely on the international legal definition. And to be sure, these critiques have been highly productive. But I want to suggest that we can take our analysis and our organizing even further by understanding apartheid as a system of racial capitalism. By differentially valuing people's lives and their labor, racial capitalist regimes intensify exploitation and dispossession while exposing marginalized groups to abandonment or elimination. Or to use Ruth D. Gilmore's definition, which Leopold mentioned earlier, the group-based exposure to premature death. The concept of racial capitalism helps make it clear that it is impossible to eliminate either racial domination or class inequality without tackling the system as a whole. Israeli apartheid operates by fragmenting the Palestinian population and subjecting each fragment to a different form of racial rule. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip are subjects of Israeli military rule. Palestinians from East Jerusalem have tenuous residency rights, but face massive pressure to displacement. 1948, Palestinians have second-class citizenship in Israel, and Palestinian refugees confront an enforced absence in the diaspora. Yet they all face oppression from the same racial state. Since the 1990s, Israel has restructured its military occupation under the guise of the Oslo peace process. Oslo enabled Israel to fragment the occupied territories, concentrating the Palestinian population into a series of isolated enclosures and aggressively colonizing the land that remains. Israel withdrew its military from Palestinian cities and refugee camps and surrounded these areas with checkpoints, fences, walls, and Israeli-only bypass roads, and then established a permit regime to regulate Palestinian movement. The Palestinian Authority was established as a limited self-governing body for Palestinians within these enclosures, marked areas A and B on this map. But Israel retains full jurisdiction over Area C, which makes up 60% of the West Bank, and ultimate sovereignty over the entire territory. The Gaza Strip has been transformed into a concentration camp through a deadly siege that's been described by Ilan Pappé as incremental genocide. In short, Oslo has intensified rather than reversing Israel's settler colonial project. While these colonial practices of the apartheid state may be familiar, most discussions of Palestine overlook the impact of neoliberal restructuring on Israel's violent settler colonial project. Adam Haniyeh, Tawfiq Haddad, and Haim Yacobi provide important exceptions to this tendency. Analyzing apartheid as a system of racial capitalism allows us to see that Israeli settler colonialism now operates through neoliberalism. Since the 80s, Israel has undergone a fundamental transition from a state-led economy focused on domestic consumption to a corporate-driven economy integrated into the circuits of global capitalism. The Oslo negotiations were central to this neoliberal project, as Israeli business elites envisioned that the peace process would open the markets of the Arab world to US and Israeli capital and facilitate Israel's integration into the global economy. And that's largely played out. Neoliberal restructuring has enabled Israel to carry out its settler colonial strategy by reducing Israeli reliance on Palestinian workers. Free trade agreements with Egypt and Jordan and Israel's transition to a high-tech economy have reduced the demand for industrial and agricultural workers. And neoliberal restructuring on a global scale has led to the immigration of more than 1 million Russian Jews and 300,000 migrant workers who now compete with Palestinians for the remaining low-wage jobs. The settler colonial state thus used neoliberal restructuring to engineer the disposability of the Palestinian population. The only sector of the Israeli economy that has retained a relatively steady demand for Palestinian workers is construction, due largely to the expansion of Israeli settlements and the wall in the West Bank. These are Palestinian workers building the wall around Bethlehem. According to a 2011 survey, 82% of Palestinians employed in the settlements would leave their jobs if they could find a suitable alternative. As one Palestinian worker explains, quote, "What logic is there to this? That Arabs build houses for Jews on land belonging to Arabs. Why am I doing this? Because I must work and earn money for my family, and so I build. And in my heart, I pray that tomorrow they will return all this land to Arabs. And I hate myself, but I have no choice." Palestinians from Gaza don't even have this choice. As Haidar Eid explains, Gaza is one of the most extreme cases of engineered disposability on earth. Political and economic restructuring have transformed Gaza into a prison built to concentrate and contain an unwanted surplus population. The ever-intensifying Israeli siege, punctuated by repeated Israeli assaults and invasions, most recently this May, demonstrate the complete dehumanization of the Palestinian population. Palestinian lives have no value, and Palestinian deaths do not matter to the Israeli regime. While the majority of Palestinians confront poverty, unemployment, land confiscation, and repression, a small Palestinian elite has emerged in the West Bank, composed of the PA leadership, Palestinian capitalists, and NGO officials. Many Palestinian capitalists rely on permits from the Israeli state to conduct their business, to bring in exports, imports, anything like that. And so they're structurally positioned in a way that they find themselves pressured into, some form of collusion. Others, actively participate in the colonial project and profit by selling concrete and stones for the construction of settlements in the wall. Similarly, a Hamas-affiliated bourgeoisie has emerged in Gaza since 2006. So visitors to Ramallah and other cities are often surprised to see these palatial mansions, expensive restaurants, five-star hotels, luxury vehicles in the streets. These are not signs of a thriving economy. They're signs of a growing class divide in Palestinian society. So overall, neoliberal apartheid has transformed Palestinians into a truly disposable population and enabled Israel to carry out its project of concentration and colonization. An important question that animates Palestinian liberation movements today is how to avoid the pitfalls of post-apartheid South Africa in developing a vision for post-apartheid Palestine, Israel. An end to military occupation, full legal equality, and the right of return are baseline demands. But South Africa provides a cautionary tale about the limits of a purely rights-based approach. Recognizing the neoliberal aspects of Israeli apartheid could help contribute to the development of strategies to challenge not only the regime of racial domination, but the system of racial capitalism. Addressing the system of racial capitalism also forces us to attend to the global dynamics of inequality and empire. US imperialism, neoliberal restructuring, and climate catastrophe have accelerated dispossession and intensified inequality around the world. Wealth and income are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a transnational class of billionaire capitalists. In many places, neoliberalization has been coupled with political independence, formal equality, or some form of partial autonomy, which has enabled some members of historically subjugated populations to join the ranks of the elite. We see neoliberals celebrating Black elites in South Africa, Palestinian elites in the West Bank, Black and Latinx middle classes in the United States as evidence that the free market capitalism can end racial and colonial conflict. In doing so, however, they disavow the continued significance of racism. At the same time, neoliberal restructuring has intensified both racialized exploitation and racialized abandonment. By differentially valuing human lives and labor, processes of racial and gender formation mark some populations for a life of super exploitation in sweatshops and service industries, while subjecting others to a life of disposability, abandonment, and early death. Yet the racialized poor remain materially and symbolically valuable. They not only drive down wages for the precariously employed, they also become what Frantz Fanon called phobogenic objects, symbols of danger that loom large in the anxieties of the powerful. Racialized threat discourses circulate around the globe, equating Black people with criminality and Arabs and Muslims with terrorism, symbolically transforming the most marginalized into sources of violence. And these discourses help to justify the expansion of military and carceral interventions. Carcerality is a fundamental part. I think I skipped it. Anyway, we'll keep the slide here. I think I had missed one. Carcerality, right, and repression is a fundamental part of neoliberal apartheid. Relying on coercion to uphold unstable social orders, neoliberal apartheid regimes protect the powerful by policing the racialized poor, containing them in prisons and zones of abandonment, subjecting them to constant surveillance, displacing them across borders, and targeting them with violence and death. Neoliberal carcerality is not simply a class project to contain and control surplus populations. It is also shaped by white supremacy. In the United States and South Africa, for instance, law and order policing were a demand by the white right in the wake of the civil rights and the anti-apartheid movements. In Palestine, it's a strategy for expanding Israeli settler colonial domination and enforcing the differential valuation of Jewish and Palestinian life. Neoliberal apartheid regimes like Israel, South Africa, and the US depend on advanced carceral strategies to maintain power. But these strategies do not operate in isolation. Instead, policing is increasingly operationalized through networks of state and private security forces that crisscross the globe, but that congeal in context-specific formations at a range of geographical scales, from the local to the regional to the global. Building on Laleh Khalili's work, we can trace the flows of technology, expertise, data, and discourse that provide the infrastructure for these global carceral webs. Israel has built a multi-layered system of policing that's centered on Israeli state violence, but is supported by an imperial network of security forces and operationalized through a regime of security coordination that draws the colonized into their own oppression. Israeli police, military, and intelligence agencies drive the settler colonial project by preventing the return of refugees, enforcing second-class citizenship, concentrating the West Bank Palestinians into archipelagos of isolated enclosures, and transforming the Gaza Strip into a concentration camp, and by violently repressing any dissent. Israel is also an integral part of the US empire, which uplifts the apartheid state through direct political, ideological, and military support by facilitating regional security coordination with Egypt and Jordan, by managing the security coordination between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and by building a global war grounded in the archetype of the Arab and Muslim terrorist. Since 2007, the Palestinian Authority security forces have been completely reorganized under the supervision of the United States and deployed to ensure the security of Israel. The PA security forces are more than 80,000 strong. They're vetted by the United States, trained by the US and Jordan using the same facilities and the same contractors that trained the Iraqi army after 2003, and deployed throughout the West Bank enclaves in close coordination with the Israeli military to suppress resistance to Israeli apartheid. Israel and the PA security forces share intelligence, coordinate arrests, and cooperate on weapons confiscations. They target Islamists, leftists, and all Palestinian critics of Oslo. Israeli and US officials often celebrate the success of these operations, but Palestinians increasingly view security coordination as one of the worst aspects of Oslo. This was on display this summer when the PA security forces arrested and killed Nizar Banat for criticizing security coordination with Israel, and then violently and brutally repressed the demonstrations demanding justice for Nizar. Israeli strategies to police Palestinians are also connected to a global web of racial capitalist projects to contain and pacify the racialized poor around the world. Israeli security companies export expertise by training police departments in crowd control, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism. In addition, Israeli private security companies are at the forefront of a multi-billion-dollar global industry for security technology. Incubated by the Israeli military, these private companies develop drones, biometric scanners, and other advanced surveillance technology, which they advertise as being field tested in the Gaza Strip. Treating military occupation as a market opportunity, Israeli corporations are integral to the regime of imperial policing that upholds global apartheid. Flows of technology, discourse, and war also link the South African, post-apartheid South Africa into this imperial network. State violence remains crucial to enforcing racial capitalism in South Africa. The South African police suppress social movements and worker struggles, most notoriously by massacring 34 striking workers at Marikana platinum mines in 2012. The police also employ a range of everyday practices designed to criminalize and contain the Black poor in South Africa's still segregated townships. Alongside the police, however, private security has emerged as the primary force for securing the accumulated wealth and privilege of the South African elite. Since 1994, private security has been the fastest growing industry in South Africa, commodifying a racialized discourse of Black criminality to transform formerly white neighborhoods into a world of walled enclosures. The market for private security is largely driven by residential demand, walls on private property, gates around neighborhoods, alarms and access control technology, and armed rapid response services. Companies are also experimenting with private versions of preventive security patrols that rely on constant surveillance, aggressive stops, intimidation, and violence to regulate the presence of working class Black people in wealthy neighborhoods. A neighborhood in Cape Town went so far as to institute a version of a pass system requiring workers to maintain a pass to move through the neighborhood. Importantly, though, much of the technology that these South African private security companies deploy in these wealthy residences is produced by Israeli corporations, the corporations that I mentioned earlier. Moreover, the South African private security industry has deep connections to the circuits of the US empire. At least 10,000 South African mercenaries have served as private military contractors in the battlefields of Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and elsewhere. The most highly trained, highest paid operators therefore circulate between contracts with private security companies securing the wealth of the South African elite and private military companies enforcing US imperial domination. Policing in the United States is rooted in the elimination of the native, the criminalization of Blackness, the suppression of immigrant and working class radicalism, and the struggle for global domination and capitalist hegemony. Neoliberal restructuring in the United States has generated extreme inequality, concentrations of racialized poverty, and advanced strategies to protect the powerful by policing the racialized poor. My work focuses on policing in Chicago, but similar processes are at work in neoliberal apartheid cities across the country. Over the last 30 years, economic and political elites have transformed downtown Chicago into a hub of corporate finance and real estate capital, and turned the North Side lakefront into a gentrified playground for professionals and tourists. Neoliberals celebrate the growth of Black and brown professional classes and use this to blame the racialized poor for their own deepening marginalization. But it is the elimination of stable jobs, union wages, public housing, public education, mental health care, and other social services that has intensified the crises facing working class Black and brown neighborhoods on Chicago's south and west sides. For many neighborhoods, divestment and decline lay the foundations for gentrification and displacement. Like all neoliberal regimes, Chicago relies on policing and surveillance to enforce order and contain crises. The Chicago Police Department, or CPD, receives a $1.79 billion annual budget, or 40% of the city's entire budget. But policing in Chicago is not limited to the local police department. Local, state, and federal agencies form a dense criminalizing web that ensnares working class communities of color. Flows of data, technology, training, and discourse facilitate this coordination amongst the agencies within this network, which operates through three interconnected police wars. First, the war on crime, which is known in Chicago as the war on gangs, is used to justify police deployments designed to monitor, contain, and eliminate Black and Latinx populations by concentrating surveillance and violence and state violence in working class communities of color. The Chicago Police Department maintains a gang database that includes more than 134,000 names. 95% are Black or Latinx, 70% Black, 25% Latinx, which demonstrate that this data is grounded in racialized discourses of criminality. Moreover, the Chicago Police Department shares its gang database with over 500 agencies around the country and participates in joint task forces with the FBI and other federal agencies to track and target alleged gang members. Police overwhelmingly target Black and Latinx people with strategies such as stop and frisk and flood Black and brown neighborhoods with troops. They recently renamed these flooding operations where they'll send 100 or more troops at a time into a particular neighborhood. They started calling them surge operations, borrowing terminology from the US military. Local and federal agencies increasingly also rely on advanced forms of racialized surveillance, including an ever-growing arsenal of advanced technology. There are 35,000 security cameras in Chicago that the police have access to, which might not seem like much to you guys in London, but it's the largest number in the US. License plate readers, gunshot detection sensors, cell site simulators, social media monitoring software, as well as predictive algorithms, social network analysis, and other advanced technologies to police Black and brown neighborhoods. The war on immigrants in the United States seesaws between the Republican generalized assault on all undocumented immigrants and the Democrats who target their attack on immigrants who are labeled criminals or gang members. Chicago is officially what's known as a sanctuary city, which means the police are not supposed to cooperate with federal authorities to enforce immigration laws. But there are loopholes and exceptions to this rule. Until earlier this year, Chicago's sanctuary ordinance denied protection to 4 categories of immigrants: anyone with an immigrant with a felony conviction, a felony charges, an arrest warrant, or a person whose name appeared on a police gang database was not afforded any of the sanctuary protections. US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is one of the 500 plus agencies that could access CPD databases. So from 2009 to 2018, ICE searched the CPD databases over 32,000 times to identify supposed gang members as priority targets for deportation. Mind you, most of that time was during the Obama regime. Under Trump, they didn't target gang members. They went after every immigrant without documentation. Flows of data, so therefore, bypass the sanctuary protections and enable collaboration and collusion between the CPD and ICE. Moreover, the local police are the ones who manufacture labels like felon and gang member in the first place by stopping, frisking, and arresting young people in immigrant neighborhoods and recording their names on their databases. Finally, the war on terror has transformed policing by expanding the web of surveillance, encouraging data sharing, and enabling the militarization of local police departments. Many new forms of surveillance rely on racialized discourses of terrorism to target Arabs and Muslims. For instance, the state deputizes residents to monitor one another through programs such as countering violent extremism, which is similar to Prevent in the UK. In addition, the Department of Homeland Security encourages surveillance through programs such as If You See Something, Say Something. Whenever a person reports something through this program, what gets written up is called a suspicious activity report. The local police draw up the suspicious activity report. Of the people whose racial identity is listed on Chicago's suspicious activity report database, 77% are people of color. 54% are identified as Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, or quote, olive-skinned. Local police then share these reports with the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which carries out further investigations. In addition, what are known as fusion centers are another new mechanism of data sharing. These are high-tech surveillance centers located in each state and in every major city, and designed to facilitate interagency coordination and data sharing. At the Chicago Police Department's headquarters, for instance, there is a fusion center that's staffed not only by Chicago police, but in the same room, you have officers from the Illinois State Police, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and a dozen other agencies that work constantly to ensure the flow of data, such as the suspicious activity reports and other information between local, state, and federal agencies. As part of the war on terror, the US has also established new mechanisms for sharing data and intelligence with partners such as Israel to support US imperial projects around the world. This network of policing upholds racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and empire by protecting property and the lives that are valued, containing racialized surplus populations, regulating the immigrant working class, suppressing resistance, and enforcing empire. And the neoliberalization of racial capitalism has generated similar dynamics in much of the world: extreme inequality, racialized poverty, and militarized policing. Unable to establish hegemony, neoliberal apartheid regimes rely heavily on repression. Policing increasingly operates through networks of private and state security forces that extend beyond national boundaries through networks of empire. Flows of technology, expertise, data, and discourse constitute the infrastructure that link these forces together as carceral webs take shape to enforce and expand neoliberal apartheid regimes at a variety of scales, from the local to the national, to the regional, to the global. But these circuits of imperial policing are also being met by circuits of transnational solidarity, from South Africa to Palestine to the UK and the US and beyond. Through principled forms of joint struggle and revolutionary solidarity, movements are providing visions of liberation and of abolition that stretch from local police and private security companies to federal immigration authorities and national security agencies, to the prison and military industrial complexes, and ultimately to the racial capitalist US empire itself. And it's in these movements and in these joint struggles that I place my hope and my faith for a better future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very, very much, Andy, for such a wonderful and, a moving, I would also say, presentation, but also a glance of hope at the end. So I really want to thank you. What we are going to do now, we are going maybe to present, we'll start with Tuna's question, and then I'll let Andy answer, and then we'll go to free answer, and hopefully there will be some more comments and questions. So Andy, I don't know if you can see the Q&A box. I guess you can.
Let me find it.
Yeah, excellent presentation, Andy. Salim Vali said. Okay, thanks, Salim. So Andy, can you see Tuna's question? Thanks for this very interesting presentation. I agree that neoliberalization is also a political project next to being a political economic ideology. Andy, I'm wondering whether you link neoliberalization of racial capitalism in cities of apartheid to land and property market dynamics in your work. And I think this is a very important question for those of us dealing with planning. To me, land and property are crucial instruments of neoliberalism. I wonder how these are influencing the apartheid dynamics in Israel, Palestine, or in South Africa, and whether planning regulations work as an instrument of neo-apartheid in this context. That's a heavy question, Tuna, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Tuna. Appreciate that question and your questions from earlier today as well. Yeah, this was something that was particularly I emphasize quite a bit in my work on South Africa and in Palestine and Israel was land and property. One of the ways that this plays out in the colonization of the West Bank is through the encouragement by the state of Israel of kind of private market transfers of property from Palestinians to Israelis. So the state has created regulations to encourage, private land sales, often by concealing the participants. So the sales don't need to be publicized for something like 25 years in order to make it possible for Israelis and Palestinians, for Israelis or for international settlement organizations to purchase land from Palestinians while concealing the identity of the Palestinians who are participating in those sales. And it's you see it throughout the West Bank. There are several places around Bethlehem where these kind of private land purchases have really, enabled a settler colonial project. So, yeah, in South Africa as well, I think that, one of the things that I tried to focus on was the post-apartheid states, refusal to take a more active approach to land redistribution. What the South African government adopted is what's known as the willing seller, willing buyer program, which is a World Bank approved form of land redistribution, in which the state will provide support if there's a Black person who wants to purchase land and a white person who's willing to sell it. The state will help subsidize that sale by providing a little bit of financial support to the transaction, but it really depends upon both the willingness of the white landowner to agree to sell the land and to agree on a price, and it depends upon having that that initial access to capital on the part of the aspiring land purchasers. And this has had, real impacts on the ability of the state to redistribute and to be attentive to many of the hopes and even of the Black South African majority, and to many of the promises that were contained in documents such as the Freedom Charter. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Okay, now we have another question by Fui, who is one of the DPU students. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Clarno. In your experience, what are effective strategies and actions people can take to influence corporates and our elected leaders to take action to end of the occupation of the occupied Palestine territory?
Yeah, thanks, Fui. I think this is obviously a crucial and urgent question. I think that one of the at the basis, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign has provided a set of toolkits for thinking about how people and civil society organizations at universities and churches and in our communities can organize to target the Israeli regime and corporations that profit from the organization or participate in apartheid. I think that the corporate campaigns and divestment campaigns are one of the kind of most important and most effective aspects of that. The UN has recently published a partial list of corporations that do business in occupied territories. And, I think Ben and Jerry's recently, agreed to stop producing and selling ice cream there. And I think that these are really an important aspect of, targeting the corporations, targeting the companies that profit from the occupation, because in this current moment, the role of these global corporations is crucial, not only for what they do, for their role in uplifting and supporting the Israeli apartheid, but oftentimes in oppressing people around the world. And so these corporate campaigns, divestment campaigns, provide a really important tool for linking Palestinians with people in other parts of the world struggling against, repression by the same corporations. One of the most effective campaigns in recent years, the G4S campaign. G4S is the biggest global private security company that runs prisons inside Israel, and you find their trucks and their guards, protecting wealth and sites of privilege around the world. But there have been really powerful solidarity campaigns, Black Americans connecting with Palestinians to target G4S, not only for the work that they do inside, running prisons inside the occupied territories, but also detention centers in the United States and other facilities like that. And I think that those sites of joint struggle are really crucial in terms of thinking about, building movements. And I would say that, ultimately, like in recent years, that direction of thinking about joint struggle, at least here in the United States, has really galvanized the Palestine solidarity movement. Most of the primary Palestine solidarity organizations in the United States in the last 6 years have embraced, a principled form of joint struggle as being the vision for transformation, with the idea that, that the liberation of Palestine is completely tied into the struggle for liberation among Black and Indigenous people in the United States as well. And it's through the transformation of all of these sites that freedom will really come forward. And so joint struggle is not just about how to put pressure on Israel, but how to create real transformation for people from the United States to Palestine and beyond. I hope that helps answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. I hope, I think, I think there is another question that for some reason I don't see it fully on my screen from Charlotte. Can you see it, Andy? Ironically, sorry, there's a problem with this computer. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. So Charlotte's question is about the kind of recent riots, looting, arson in South Africa, as ex-president Jacob Zuma was imprisoned. But yeah, it seems clear to that there are layers and levels of kind of motivation, shaping those uprisings, which you point to here, I think in your question itself, right, revealing these deeper tensions about inequality 25 years after the end of apartheid. There's tremendous frustration. The social movements that mobilized in the earlier parts of the 21st century to really, to galvanize and provide further, instruments, organizational instruments for transformation, were repressed, were contained, and there's really important work happening in South Africa around trying to make sense of, what are the outlets for people to rise up just to protest and to envision a different world. And I think that there seems to be clearly, like, these recent uprisings, there was clearly an aspect of political manipulation on the part of Zuma's supporters, but there was also something much deeper there at work as well, right? And I don't think that I necessarily have the tools to kind of parse out the proper kind of layers of that explanation. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's probably a pretty pretty ineffective answer. Sorry, Charlotte, I would love to talk more about this, but
thanks. I think we have another comment. I don't think it's a question, I think more a comment. So Andy, if you could read it aloud, so it will help.
Where we at?
I can't see it properly. From Nikki.
From Nikki.
Yeah.
It says, thanks, Andy, for a powerful presentation. Listening from Joburg while gazing at my own electric fence, I was struck by your slideshow showing the Joburg and Jerusalem walls. One of the things that characterizes middle classes in Joburg is how we try to aestheticize our security apparatus, trees, ornamental bars, attractive walls. Absolutely, absolutely true. And of course, this is very different in Jerusalem. How do we understand the different appeals to white sensibilities in these different walls? What does it mean that the white South Africans demand these kind of aesthetic features to their security paraphernalia, whereas white Israelis seem to want more unvarnished military style tech? I think this is this is such an important point. The aesthetics of the walls, the images you see in Palestine, I mean, these 8-meter tall concrete walls, in densely populated urban areas are intended to portray powerlessness, right? And in a way that is designed to expand power, right? Whereas in South Africa, all the ornamentation on the walls is I don't know. Again, I think that you've largely answered the question. I mean, I think that sensibility of that this is not apartheid, that this is just everyday life, that these are domestic spaces. It portrays kind of an image that this is not a military or repressive, security apparatus, but it's belied by the barbed wire, the electrical wire, the security cameras, the lasers, all of the various different, high-tech devices that accompany the walls, as well as the private guards and the security companies patrolling the neighborhoods in their trucks. The language, I did a lot of interviews with these private security companies, and the language that they use to describe Black people, they incorporate military language. They often refer to Black people as bravos. There are 2 bravos walking down the street. We need to stop them and check them, right? So there's it's a sanitized approach, but it's still, very much grounded in military and repressive force.
I'm afraid that we have to, to leave you all and have a 15 minutes break before the last 2 sessions of our workshop today. But I mean, I really want to thank you, Andy, because I feel that, some of your insights are highly relevant to those of you who are working, in the field of urban or critical urban studies. And I think that, your work really gives a kind of, I would say, the relevant perspective to rethink, urban politics these days. So I really want to thank you. And I would like to apologize to those who face problems entering the webinar event. It has been also broadcasted on Facebook, and it is recorded. So I hope that we will be able to share it with you if you are interested. And I'm sorry about the questions that we didn't have time to answer. So thank you very much. We will meet the participants of the workshop in 15 minutes, the same link, Zoom link of the morning. So thank you very, very much. And thanks again for our colleagues who work on the interpretation of this event. Shukran, thank you.